Welcome back. She gave everything to her family. But they betrayed her, broken but not defeated. She rose and fought back. If you've ever been hurt, this is for you. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday afternoon. But instead, I lay on a stiff hospital bed at Seattle General Hospital, clutching my phone with trembling hands as tears blurred my vision. The sterile scent of disinfectant filled the room, but nothing could mask the sharp pain in my abdomen or the deeper ache in my chest. We told you not to bother us with this again, Rachel. My mother's voice snapped coldly through the speakerphone, her words cutting deeper than any scalpel ever could. We've been planning this cruise for months. You'll figure something out, like you always do. I stared at my 2-year-old twins, Leo and Lily, sitting quietly in the corner with their stuffed animals, unaware that their mother was about to be wheeled into emergency surgery. With no one to care for them when I was gone, my heart pounded, both from fear and disbelief. I had always been there for my parents, paying their mortgage, sending them thousands each month since they retired early, yet here they were, choosing their Caribbean vacation over their only daughter in her time of greatest need. As the nurse, Nina, gently adjusted my IV and checked my vitals, she offered me a small, kind smile, a rare light in this moment of darkness. You shouldn't have to go through this alone, she said softly, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder. Her compassion nearly broke me, because as much as I wanted to pretend otherwise, I was alone. My husband Mark was gone, taken by a drunk driver 6 months earlier. And now my parents had turned their backs on me too. And for the first time, I realized something painfully clear: if I didn't protect myself and my children, no one else would. Looking back, I realized this wasn't the first time my parents had let me down, it was simply the most brutal. For as long as I could remember, I had been the invisible daughter, the one expected to carry the weight of everyone else's needs while quietly burying her own. My younger sister, Isabel, had always been the star, the golden child, with a glamorous life as a social media influencer, constantly showered with praise and attention. Meanwhile, I was the one who paid my parents' bills behind the scenes, keeping them afloat when they decided to retire early without any real savings. It had started with small things, covering their car payments, sending extra money for house repairs, but as time went on, those small things turned into a $2,500 monthly transfer to help maintain their upscale lifestyle. They had sold the story to everyone, even to me, that family helps family, and I had clung to that idea, believing that one day they would be there for me too. But when Mark died in that horrific accident, everything I thought I knew shattered. Suddenly a widow at 33 with 2 toddlers to raise, I found myself drowning in grief, trying to keep our little family together while my parents continued to ask for money, never once offering to help with the twins or check on how I was coping. I had told myself it was just who they were, selfish but harmless, until the day I called. Desperate, explaining the emergency surgery and begging them to watch Leo and Lily. Instead of love or concern, all I got was my mother's sharp dismissal and my father's cold voice adding, "Rachel, you're starting to sound like a burden. We deserve to enjoy our retirement." Those words kept echoing in my mind, louder than the machines beeping in my hospital room. What hurt most was that I had supported them even when I had nothing left to give, even when I was drowning in my own medical bills after Mark's death and scraping by on freelance work to keep a roof over my kids' heads. All I had wanted was one moment of kindness, a little help for their own grandchildren, and they couldn't even give me that. It was in that realization, of years spent giving to people who never truly loved me the way a family should, that I felt something shift inside. The version of me who spent her life chasing their approval was starting to crack. And though I was still weak, I could feel a new strength trying to break through, a strength that would no longer accept being treated as an afterthought. As I lay in that hospital bed, the weight of everything pressed down on me, the searing pain in my side, the overwhelming fear of what would happen to Leo and Lily if something went wrong in surgery, and the crushing realization that I had no family to rely on. The doctor's voice had been grave when he explained that the internal bleeding was worse than expected and I needed to be operated on immediately. Still, when I called my parents one last time, hoping, begging for even a sliver of compassion, my mother sighed as though I had interrupted something trivial. And my father's voice grew sharper. Rachel, we've already explained. We're flying out for the cruise in the morning. You can't expect us to drop everything just because you're being dramatic. Dramatic. That word echoed in my chest like a punch. As if needing emergency surgery was some performance. I wanted to scream, but the pain was too much. That's when Nina, the nurse who had been monitoring my vitals, leaned closer, her eyes filled with gentle concern that I hadn't seen from anyone else in weeks. Rachel, do you have anyone to help with your twins? She asked quietly. Glancing over at Leo and Lily, who were now sitting side by side on the floor, their wide eyes watching me with confusion. My throat tightened. I shook my head, tears finally breaking free. I don't, I whispered. I thought I did, but I don't. Nina gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Listen, I have a close friend, Claire. She's a professional nanny, trained to work with children who've gone through trauma. I can call her if you want. For a moment, I hesitated. I had never trusted anyone outside of family with my children. But then again, what family? I realized these strangers had shown me more kindness than my own parents. With a shaky breath, I nodded. Yes, please, call her. Saying those words felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. But also like lifting a weight I had carried for too long. As Nina stepped out to make the call, I reached for my phone, the device heavy in my hand, and stared at the bank transfer app, where I was scheduled to send my parents another $2,500 next week. Money that could now save me and my children instead. My finger hovered over the screen, and though my body was weak, my mind was starting to clear. For the first time, I asked myself, what if I stopped sacrificing everything for people who wouldn't lift a finger for me? As Nina returned to my room, her voice gentle but hopeful, she let me know that Claire was on her way and would arrive within the hour. Just hearing that made my chest loosen a little. Though fear still curled in my stomach, not just fear of surgery, but of what life would look like if I finally stopped holding my parents up like a crumbling bridge. As they prepped me for surgery, attaching wires and monitors to my chest, I asked Nina quietly, could you hand me my phone? One more time? She looked at me with soft understanding and placed it in my hand. My fingers trembled, but I knew what I had to do. First, I opened my banking app and canceled every future automatic transfer to my parents' account. It felt like tearing off a bandage that had been stuck for years, painful but necessary. Then I pulled up the last text thread with my mother, scrolled past her dismissive messages, and began typing, I will no longer be providing financial support. My children and I deserve better than being treated like afterthoughts. Please do not contact me again. My thumb hovered over the send button for a long moment, heart pounding, but when I pressed it, a strange wave of relief crashed over me. It was done. No more begging for their love or sacrificing my family's stability for their luxuries. As the nurse wheeled me toward the operating room, Leo and Lily stood at the door with Nina, their tiny faces watching me with wide, uncertain eyes. I smiled through my fear and mouthed, I love you, to them. Knowing that whatever happened next, I had taken the first real step to protect them, and myself. I realized then that family isn't defined by blood, but by who shows up when it matters. Claire, a woman I hadn't even met yet, was on her way to care for my children, while my own parents were busy packing for a cruise. The injustice of that burned. But as I was pushed through the hospital doors and the bright lights of the OR came into view, a quiet voice inside me whispered something I hadn't felt in years, strength. I didn't know what life would look like on the other side of that surgery. But I knew one thing for sure, I was done living for people who never truly loved me. When I woke up after surgery, groggy and sore, the first thing I saw was Claire, sitting in the chair beside my bed, holding Lily in her lap while Leo played quietly on the floor. The twins were safe, and for a brief moment, a wave of gratitude pushed away the fog of pain. But when I finally turned to check my phone, my heart sank. 32 missed calls, countless text messages, all from my parents. The messages followed a predictable cycle, first confusion, then outrage, and finally desperation. My mother wrote, Rachel, this is ridiculous. You can't just cut us off. What are we supposed to do about the mortgage? Another message from my father came minutes later, you're overreacting. We've always done everything for you. And this is how you repay us? I stared at the screen, numb, the hypocrisy of their words twisting in my chest. They had done everything for me? Where were they when I was in the hospital, facing possible death, with no one to care for their grandchildren? As if the barrage of messages wasn't enough. Isabel called too. When I finally answered her video chat, too tired to pretend I wasn't screening her calls, her face was a mix of confusion and concern. Mom and Dad are freaking out, she said without preamble. They told me you're being dramatic and trying to punish them. What's going on, Rachel? Why are you cutting them off like this? I swallowed hard, realizing my parents had twisted the truth before it even had a chance to be heard. Isabel, I whispered, my throat dry and voice hoarse. I was in emergency surgery. They refused to help with Leo and Lily because they didn't want to miss their cruise. That's what's going on. Her mouth dropped open in shock. Wait, what? Mom said you were having some minor thing, like an outpatient procedure. My chest tightened. Even now, my parents were gaslighting, rewriting reality to make themselves look like the victims. Isabel blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what I was saying. Rachel, I didn't know. If I had known it was serious, I would have been there. I would have watched the twins. For the first time in years, I heard sincerity in her voice. And something like regret. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't fully on their side. As I lay there, physically broken but emotionally sharper than I'd felt in months, I realized that my parents had built their entire narrative on lies. And for years, I had let them, but now, there was no going back. The truth was out, and I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. In the weeks following my surgery, as my body slowly began to heal, something even more profound started to mend, my sense of worth. Though I was still weak and sore, especially around the incision site, I found myself surrounded by people who genuinely cared, not because they wanted something from me, but because they saw me as a human being worthy of love and support. Claire was a godsend, arriving every morning like clockwork to care for Leo and Lily. She was more than a nanny, she was a calming presence. Reading to them, playing gentle games, and comforting them when they cried for me. Nina, the nurse who had first introduced Claire, stayed in touch, stopping by after her shifts with bags of groceries or just a hot meal she had made herself. And then there was Diane, a woman I met through the young widowed parents support group Nina had told me about. Diane had lost her husband to cancer 2 years before, leaving her to raise a 3-year-old son alone. From our first conversation, she felt like an old friend, someone who didn't flinch at the word widow and didn't offer pity, but understanding. She even helped me realize that I didn't have to stay trapped in my cramped apartment. There are better neighborhoods with support systems, and probably for less than you're paying now, she said, her words planting seeds of hope. And for the first time since Mark died, I felt hopeful, too. I began to take on small design projects again, freelance work that let me create at my own pace, and eventually, I launched a side business designing memorial websites, something that had brought me peace when I built one for Mark and now was helping others honor their lost loved ones. The money I was no longer sending to my parents? It went toward paying Claire, rebuilding an emergency fund, and buying healthier food for the twins. And Isabel surprised me, too, showing up with home-cooked meals, offering to help around the house, and playing with Leo and Lily like she was making up for lost time. It wasn't perfect, and I still had days where grief swallowed me whole. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was starting to live. As my life slowly began to stabilize, my parents' carefully constructed world was beginning to fall apart, and this time, I wasn't there to hold it up. A few weeks after cutting them off, Isabel called me in a panic, her voice low and urgent. Rachel, Mom and Dad are in serious trouble. The bank is threatening foreclosure on the house. They're months behind on payments. And Dad's been trying to get loans, but no one's approving him. I listened quietly, feeling a complicated tangle of emotions, sadness, anger, and, strangely, relief. For years, I had been the one keeping them afloat, paying for their luxuries while they pretended to be financially secure. Now, without my monthly transfers, the truth was catching up with them. A week later, as I was helping Leo and Lily build a block tower on the living room floor, there was a knock at the door. My stomach sank when I peeked through the peephole and saw both my parents standing there. My mother with her designer handbag clutched tightly in her hands. My father holding a folder of papers. Against my better judgment, I opened the door just enough to speak. "Rachel, we need to talk," my father began, his voice less confident than usual. Reluctantly, I let them in, watching as they sat stiffly at my small dining table, a far cry from their grand home. My father slid the folder across the table to me. "This is everything," he said, and when I opened it, I saw a spreadsheet of debts, mortgage arrears, credit card balances, and an outstanding loan they had taken on their boat. I looked up at them, my heart pounding. "So what are you asking for?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We need $144 to catch up on everything," my mother said, her voice wavering now. "Rachel, we've always counted on you. You promised to take care of us." I swallowed the lump in my throat, anger rising. "I never promised to bankroll your lifestyle while you ignored me and my kids. Where were you when I was in surgery? Begging for help? On a cruise you couldn't cancel?" My father's face tightened. "That's not fair," he started. But I cut him off. "No. What's unfair is that I gave up everything for you. And when I needed you most, you chose a vacation over your own grandchildren. I'm not your solution anymore." My mother's eyes filled with tears. But I stood firm. "You need to figure this out yourselves. Sell the boat. Sell the house if you have to. But don't ask me for another cent." For the first time, I saw real panic on their faces. And for the first time, I didn't let it become my problem. In the days following that confrontation, I found myself grappling with a storm of emotions. Part of me still carried the old guilt, that deeply ingrained feeling that I was somehow responsible for my parents' happiness, for their survival. For so many years, I had been the one to fix things, to give until I had nothing left. Now, standing my ground and refusing to bail them out felt both liberating and terrifying. At night, when the twins were asleep and the house was quiet, I would sit by the window, sipping tea and wondering if I had done the right thing. But every time I heard Leo's soft snoring or felt Lily's tiny arms wrap around me as she slept, I knew that protecting them, choosing us over everyone else, was the only right choice. Still, my parents weren't done trying. The text messages kept coming, each one more desperate than the last. "Rachel, please think about what you're doing to us." My mother wrote, "We could lose everything, and we're too old to start over." My father's messages were sharper, laced with the familiar guilt trips. "You're turning your back on the people who raised you. After all we've sacrificed for you." But for once, their words didn't break me. Instead, they revealed just how much they had come to expect me to shoulder their lives while they refused to take responsibility. Isabel called frequently, caught in the middle, updating me on their deteriorating finances while reassuring me I had made the right decision. "They've been lying to everyone," she said one night. "They told Aunt Linda that you promised to support them forever, but you never did. I don't blame you for saying no." Hearing that made me feel less alone, less crazy for finally drawing a line. Still, when Isabel told me that my father had suffered a health scare related to high blood pressure, I felt a pang of concern, because despite everything, a part of me still cared. But I also knew I couldn't let that part pull me back into their web. So I made a choice. I would not engage any further unless they truly acknowledged the harm they had done, not for money, not for sympathy, but because my children and I deserved peace. For the first time, I was protecting myself as fiercely as I had always tried to protect them. It wasn't until a crisp fall afternoon, nearly a year after my surgery, that the final piece of this chapter began to settle. A letter arrived, an actual handwritten letter from my mother. Something I hadn't expected and almost didn't open. But curiosity got the better of me. As I unfolded the paper, I saw words I had never imagined she would write. "Rachel, I've had a lot of time to think about everything," she began, "and for the first time, I see how badly we've treated you." She admitted that they had leaned on me for too long, expecting me to solve problems they should have handled, and that when I needed them most, they failed me completely. She didn't ask for money or forgiveness, only a chance to say she was sorry. I sat by the window, watching Leo and Lily play in the backyard of our new home, a cozy little house in a quiet neighborhood, bought with the savings I had once sent to my parents. The twins laughed as they chased each other, And for the first time in years, their joy didn't feel overshadowed by my stress. Isabel had become a regular part of our lives, visiting on weekends, cooking meals, and even helping me with the kids when I worked on my growing side business, memorial website designs that now filled my days with purpose. Even Nina and Claire had stayed close, their friendships becoming a lifeline I never knew I needed. And Diane, my friend from the widowed parents group, had shown me that rebuilding wasn't just possible, it was beautiful. Later that week, I agreed to meet my parents in a neutral cafe, keeping the boundaries firm but willing to listen. They looked different, humbled, quieter, no longer hiding behind fake confidence. My father, for the first time in my life, cried as he apologized, and though I wasn't ready to trust them fully, I told them this: if you want to know Leo and Lily, it will be on my terms, only if you respect me. And only if you've truly changed. As I walked home that day, I realized something powerful. I was no longer the daughter desperate for love. I was a mother who had chosen strength, and a woman who had chosen herself and her children above all else. And that was enough. The story teaches that setting boundaries, even with family, is essential for self-respect and emotional survival. Sometimes, the people we expect to love and support us the most can be the ones who hurt us the deepest. Choosing to protect yourself and your children is not selfish, it's necessary. True family is made up of those who show up when it matters, not those who only take. Through courage and self-love, we can break free from toxic cycles, create healthy environments for ourselves and our children, and rebuild a life filled with real love and support.